so welcome to the stage. Clap and cheer for Zoe Wyatt!
Good evening. Hi, my name is Zoe Wyatt. I am doing a PhD in mathematics. Yeah, I've got 99 problems and they're actually all maths. So I'm approaching the end of my PhD and I've actually started just putting things off until after I finish. So like I really need a new phone after I finish. Should really sort out my bike brakes after I finish. Actually, it'd be quite nice to have a positive, stress-free outlook on life. Definitely after I finish. So I'm a mathematician, but I study problems coming from physics, and I love looking at the world around us and seeing what maths and physics can tell us about it. So the irony is I was reading recently about this competition in Edinburgh, and actually worldwide, called the 3-Minute Thesis Challenge. And the premise is to explain your thesis in 3 minutes in layman's terms. I haven't competed because I don't think you're allowed to say jokes. But actually the main reason, well, I was laughing because one of the rules of the competition is you're not allowed to bring any props or experiments on stage. So if I were to compete, I'd have to go on stage and say, "Excuse me, would all the electrons please leave the room?" I think we need a new, more positive atmosphere in here. Neutral parties can remain. So, good on you for getting that. So let physics turn up. So what do I study? So I study something called the electroweak Higgs model. Don't freak out. So electro stands for electromagnetism. Yeah, this theory was discovered in the 1860s by a guy called James Clerk Maxwell, who was actually born around the corner in India Street, Edinburgh boy. So electromagnetism describes or explains how electrically charged particles interact with each other. Okay, for example, the electron, a negatively charged particle, why that is attracted to the nucleus of an atom which holds a positively charged particle, proton. Now the next part, so electroweak. So weak stands for the weak nuclear force. You could also call it the weird nuclear force. It's a bit of a funny thing. So this explains how particles interact with particles which have a kind of quantum charge called weak hypercharge. Okay, so the weak nuclear force explains things like how an up quark can turn into a down quark. It also explains things like why carbon-14 decays into nitrogen-14, okay, that process. And this underpins carbon dating. Okay, I'm sure you all heard about that. So now, when you accelerate electrons, they cause a perturbation in the electromagnetic field, which creates photons. Okay, similarly, when I accelerate these weakly charged particles, they create perturbation in the weak hyper field, and that creates other particles. 3 types of particles, so called the Z particle, the W plus particle, and the W minus particle. Now please don't freak out, there's not going to be a quiz. So the main thing to note is this weak field can generate ZW particles, and those are my initials, so now you never forget that. So now while the photon is massless, these ZW particles are massive, and they're like really big. They're like 160,000 times heavier than the mass of the electron. So they were measured in like the 1980s, and for a very long time physicists and mathematicians were trying to understand where this mass came from. And so this is where we need the third ingredient in our electroweak Higgs theory, okay, the Higgs boson, also named after a professor who is here in Edinburgh. So now, I'm sure you've all heard about the Higgs boson. It was discovered in 2012. It's amazing what you find under the sofa these days. So the Higgs is a very heavy particle. Okay, that's why it took so long to find. And that's actually true, that's scientifically correct. Yeah, cool. That actually wasn't a joke. So the Higgs is a very heavy particle, and consequently it's very lazy, okay? It likes to hang out in this low energy spot. It really doesn't like to move out of there, and we call this its ground state. Now the ground state of the Higgs is very special in that it's symmetry breaking. Okay, what is symmetry breaking? Unfortunately, unless you're a supermodel, it's your face. Yeah, it's not perfectly symmetrical. So the symmetry breaking of the Higgs is very special in that it precisely explains why 3 of the particles, these ZW particles, get their masses. But the symmetry is broken, yeah, it's not perfect. So that's why one particle remains massless. It doesn't interact with the Higgs in the same way, it doesn't get a mass. And this is precisely the massless photon. So now this electroweak Higgs model has been tested to high precision at the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. And so what do I do as a mathematician? So I mentioned that the Higgs has this ground state, this kind of low energy spot it likes to hang out in. And indeed, all the particles have this kind of low energy position they really prefer to be in. And so we call this the ground state of the theory. So my goal as a mathematician is to see whether or not this ground state is, wait for it, attractive. We have some great words in maths used in a purely naive sense. So what does this mean? So this means that if I wobble my particles slightly away from this ground state, they're slightly perturbed, I'm interested in showing that according to the equations of motion of the theory, they naturally tend back towards this ground state. Okay, this ground state attracts these perturbed solutions. Now something else which is quite subtle is that I study the classical deterministic theory. Okay, so let me give you an analogy. So probably the biggest attractor in my life is German beer. And also my German boyfriend, but he's not here, so German beer. So now, if there is a bar that serves German beer, if I'm 10 kilometres away, it's probably unlikely I'm going to tend towards that attractor state of the bar. But if I'm 10 metres away, you could probably prove that I'm going to tend towards that bar and get the German beer. However, classical deterministic theory says that given that initial condition, any time, I always have to go to that bar and get the German beer. Which is not a bad thing, but it's pretty restrictive and not so great for my boyfriend, okay? So this is classical deterministic theory. Now, I'm sure some of you smarty pants out there, those of you who have watched Marvel Ant-Man, are like, but what about the quantum world? And indeed, you're right, yeah. In quantum theory, things change totally. Things become probabilistic. And so, in fact, this classical determinism goes out the window. The reason for this is something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And this basically says that the more precisely you know the position of a particle, the less precisely can you know its momentum, and vice versa. Okay, momentum is a measure of mass times velocity. So this is a quantum effect. This is not something we see on the macroscopic level, but I like to think it answers the question of why quantum physicists are not good at sex. Because when they find their position, they lose their momentum. So indeed this electroweak Higgs model that I've spoken to you about tonight, this has been tested using quantum field theory, using quantum physics at the Large Hadron Collider. And so there's a very valid question you could now ask of what are the connections between this quantum world and the classical maths world that I've been talking about. Okay, so now there are some limits you can take, some kind of low energy approximations you can do to make sense of one in terms of the other, but by and large this is still an area of active research. So I think the full answer to that question I'm going to leave until after I finish. Thanks